we're streaming live on YouTube with slides, and we're using 3 different computers to make it happen. So hopefully it works. Hopefully people at home streaming will have good sound and everything. If not, you guys are going to have a great presentation in the room, and hopefully there'll be a transcript that people can read online. But regardless, we have a wonderful presentation this morning. Professor Troy sent over the slides, so I took a sneak peek at some of the things we're going to be looking at. We're going to have quite a discussion this morning if the slides are indicative of what we're going to see ahead of us. So I don't want to waste any time. We've had some phenomenal conversations with Professor Troy. It has been an unbelievable pleasure to have you with us, a part of the AEMT family. For the last time, I unfortunately get to say, please welcome Professor Troy to AEMT.
Thank you very much, Rabbi. It's really been an amazing and exciting weekend. I want to thank all of you for your questions, for your challenges, because if we don't have open and honest conversations, then we're wasting our time. For me, this has actually been a particularly moving weekend because my parents left the homeland, Queens, and made Yurida, descended to exit 8A off the Jersey Turnpike California many years ago. And I have to admit, it was a bit of a trauma because we used to like to have our little theater here in Queens. We could pop in for Broadway shows. But 12 years ago, my parents were smart enough to move to a one-story house. Nevertheless, had like a storage space, which was the shrine to Price Club. That was my father's favorite place, of course. And he was up there, and unfortunately, he fell 7 feet. And was in a coma for many weeks right here in Robert Wood Johnson Hospital. And when I drove up, I hadn't like put together a real resume. I had that like sort of trauma response because thank God he's still alive. I'm on my way to visit him this afternoon. 92 years old. Not what he was, but really a medical miracle. Thanks to, I don't know where that hospital is, but wherever it is. You guys are very geographically right, very well. So right over there, really, they literally saved his life, but it was not easy. And it's really nice that you've replaced that difficult memory with these really beautiful memories of the Shabbat. So I really just want to thank you, and hope that this won't be the last time you welcome me, because when you all come to Israel, I'll be happy to figure out ways to continue the conversation. So we've been on a journey today and yesterday. Gosh, you've been on a journey for our whole lifetimes. But the journey we've been trying to talk about is this whole question of modern Zionism. And talking also about the difference between Zionism and Israel, right? Israel is a particular country. Zionism is a movement that says we are a people, the rights to establish a state on a particular homeland, and ties to that particular homeland. And as I've been arguing, Zionism, political Zionism before 1948 was, there's an emergency, we've got to establish the state. Now, we still have to defend the state, unfortunately. I was just talking to my wife in Israel, and she was pointing out that today's Jerusalem Post headline emphasizes that there's this new terrorist group, the Lion's Den, which is threatening the Jews once again because the Jews only understand the language of guns and fire. So the ongoing challenge remains, and the ongoing trauma persists. But Zionism isn't just to defend. This is my problem, my friends on the right. It's also to perfect. And I've been arguing that it's also to give us a framework to find meaning. And whatever issues, whatever frustrations, whatever critiques we might have of the state, Zionism transcends the state. Because Zionism is about the dream. Zionism is about the possibility. And one of the really horrific things about what's going on in the world today, in the Jewish world today, is that the anti-Zionists who have singled out that word and glommed onto the word Zionism are robbing us not only of our joy, but of our possibility, of our dreams. And we're letting it happen. All too often, we are collaborators. And I call out the right and I call out the left. I call out the right of the Jewish world for constantly being in conflict over Israel and constantly being defensive over Israel. I don't want Israel advocacy. I want Israel. But I call out the left too for always seeing Israel through the framework of problems. It's like we're caught between this manic depressive craziness of it's either Disneyfication or demonization. And we all have to resist the trends. And so we started on Friday night with my trying to give you a vision of what I call identity Zionism. And as was pointed out in the question and answers, of course, going back to Theodor Herzl, Zionism is not just about politics, but it's also about identity. It's also about our journey. But I was emphasizing the identity piece because I think it's all too missing from the conversation in Israel and in the United States. And then on Shabbat morning, we talked about reform Zionism and the movement ambivalence at the start. Are we really a people or just a religion? How do we fit into America with its warm embrace if we're also tied to a country over there? And I argued that reform Zionism and its journey was also the journey of American Zionism. Not just because the reform movement remains the largest denomination in America, but because many of the issues are the same. And then we looked at Israel itself, and I argued that we all too often tell the story of Israel through the wars and through the conflicts, which gives Yasser Arafat and gives the Arabs who hate us, and not all Arabs hate us, but those Arabs who hate us, a victory they don't deserve. We shouldn't just see Israel through their terms, through their lens. And so today, I want to double down and zero in and ask the question of what is the relationship between Israel and the diaspora, and particularly the American Jewish community, and argue, while raising the question, some people think it's a happy marriage, it's a complicated marriage, is it a good date, is it a bad date? But fundamentally, I want to make the argument that if we repair our relationship with Israel, we're also repairing our relationship with Judaism. And that all too often you see those who are distanced from Israel are distanced from Judaism, those who are distanced from Judaism are distanced from Israel. They are intertwined. And it goes to the question we talked about yesterday about anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. My vision of identity Zionism shows how central Judaism is to the story of Israel and how central Israel is to the story of Judaism. And to the extent that they're intertwined like two strands of DNA, so to we say to the haters, you can't just say, oh, I only hate this part, not that part. You can't say, oh, I hate Italians, but I like Catholics. Because Italians and Catholics are intertwined in many ways. Similarly, you can't separate out your Jewish journey and your Zionist journey. Those who are missing a dimensionality and a centrality that's so important. So without further ado, let's go to the slides. And again, with this notion of Disneyfication and see if it works. Tell me if I can start. No, we need also a slideshow. Okay. So, which Israel do you see? Do you see the Israel of the Kotel fights and religious tensions? Do you see advancing? And now we're okay. Yeah. Sure. Yeah. Try one more time, but we're just gonna. Oh, okay. So, do you see Israel just through the headlines of religious tension and tension with the Palestinians, or do you go to the opposite extreme and see Israel as only a place where everybody's singing Hallelujah and throwing out blue and white flowers? That's the Disneyfication versus demonization dynamic. Now, by the way, I want to share with you, my friends, when I lecture in Israel, I say, which American Jewry do you see? Right? Because the headlines as often is about anti-Semitism or about Jews and Christians sort of blurring the lines between their religion. Or is it about, strong support for Israel and a deep, thoughtful, creative series of expressions of how we go on our spiritual path? And it's a mix. It's easy for us to see in our own worlds the complexity, the ups and the downs, and have a sense of ownership to fix the problems and delight in the joys. But when we look at the other, we have a tendency to go one extreme or another. And that's not healthy. A few years ago, a group of adults, not kids, went on a March of the Living type program to Auschwitz. And half of them came from Israel, and half of them came from America to study together from the American Jewish community. The Israelis wrapped themselves in the Israeli flag. And the American Jews said, "What are you doing?" The Israelis said, "When I come to Auschwitz, it's very clear to me that the central lesson is never again. And the best way to guarantee never again is through a strong state, a strong army, and a strong sense of pride. And so I wrap myself in the Israeli flag to say, we're here, we're alive. And we've learned the lesson." And this particular group of American Jews said, well, when I say never again, I say never again should nationalism be so central. And at this place in Auschwitz, you should take off all symbols of national identification. There was a fascinating back and forth of a group who were hyper-universalists and a group who were hyper-particularists. And one of the things I was arguing this weekend is, no, stop with the either or. Through our particularism, we can achieve universalism. When people look at the tensions, these days, William Galston of the Wall Street Journal wrote a very interesting article saying, well, let's be honest, Israel is going increasingly red, and American Jewry is going increasingly blue. And not only was it that Bibi and Trump seemed to have this love fest, but Bibi and Obama didn't always get along. And so there's this worry. And then we see underlying very legitimate concerns is a constant demonization of Israel. George Floyd is killed in a most terrific way. And all of a sudden, some propagandists say, oh, well, it's because the police were trained by the IDF. As if those American police who were brutally training from the IDF for police brutality. At the same time, right, we saw the, COVID-19, you heard about it? There were all these memes, COVID-48, because the Jews are behind it all. This taking of vocabulary, this hijacking of vocabulary in America about racism, about colonialism, and applying it to the Jewish state, I've argued again and again, is a form of cultural imperialism and of true distortion. Nevertheless, what sometimes say is that American Jews say, Israel is too white and too red, seeing things through a black and white lens and through this red and blue lens. And American Jews say, you're seeing things in a too black and white. This isn't a race issue. This is a national tension. There's a national conflict. And you're not blue and white enough. You're not patriotic enough. And so we can see how we can spin off into accusations. 2009, to just show that this is an old story. Professor Jack Wertheimer of the Jewish Theological Seminary wrote an article saying, it's a cliche. It's one of the most tiresome cliches of our time. To have one more article, yet another article about how Israel and American Jewry and Israelis and Americans are breaking up. So it doesn't mean there aren't tensions, but there also is this fundamental unity. And as Theodor Herzl pointed out, the Jews as a people had no self-confidence for centuries, lost, broken, wandering. You've heard me say this again and again. This is the key thing we have to keep on remembering when we get frustrated, when we have our criticisms. Our moral misery will only end when we finally believe in ourselves. And yes, Israelis have a tendency sometimes to do that a little bit too much. But, overcompensating for trauma is a natural phenomenon. Naturally, though, there will always be fights and difficulties, internal and external ones. But what country, what state does not have them? And in this, what I've been calling this arco-Zionist triumph, I keep on calling for the Jiu-Jitsu. Right? Both the Jiu-Jitsu, understanding the power of the historic Jiu-Jitsu, where we were so lost, so broken, and now we have a state with all its challenges and all its responsibilities and all its joys and all its possibilities. And understanding that we ourselves have to have a jujitsu, going from the constant propagandizing about Israel as the problem. I call it, Israel as the hunchback and the furrowed brow conversation, right? And again, I see it on the right and I see it on the left. We've got to free ourselves. We've got to appreciate that Israel and Zionism are invitations for us to our return to Jewishness. And that's why I was so excited last summer when I plunged into this project to update Theodor Herzl's Zionist writings. And I wrote a general introduction, and then I realized that he was only active for 11 years as a Zionist. He died when he was 44. And so I wrote 11 introductions each year to get a sense of what he's doing. And here, Rabbi Miller, you were talking about this. And I've been talking about the return from a leap of faith to a leap of hope. And this is the famous picture of Theodor Herzl. And I had the privilege of being in Basel and echoing him and being and following in his footsteps. And I put this up because I want to invite all of you to follow in his footsteps. He had lots of complaints and lots of criticisms about the Jewish people. He had lots of complaints and lots of criticisms about those who dared to disagree with him. But he also understood that we are a people and we are united. And that the leap of hope, I've said it twice already this weekend, I know I'm repeating myself, but education is repetition, means tomorrow will be better than today, and we roll up our sleeves to make it happen. We're really good in the age of Twitterdom of being the peanut gallery, just sitting there and throwing peanuts and complaining. We have to take responsibility and start fixing because we are one. And again, the Pew study points out 82% of American Jews, which includes most of our young people, still take pride in Israel, still say Israel is essential or important to them. So we can't let the haters run the conversation. But we have to ask a serious question. In an age where the only prediction I was willing to make in 2016 and 2020 was that the President of the United States would have a Jewish in-law. Right? Hillary Clinton, Donald Trump, Joe Biden all have Jewish in-laws. In a world where someone like Rabbi Jonathan Sacks was respected as a great philosopher, not just as a rabbi, not just ghettoized, he was Lawrence Sacks. And more important, in a world where Harry Potter himself is Jewish, Daniel Radcliffe, where we've had so many successes, where we feel so at home in America, so at home in England, so at home in Canada, so at home in Australia. Who needs a Jewish state? And it's a question that people are afraid to ask. And I want to make the argument, my friends, that we need you and you need us. We need one another. Aleph Bet Yoshua, the great Israeli writer, defines Zionism by saying the Zionist is someone who understands that Israel must be a state for all its citizens, meaning it must give equality to Arabs and Jews, Christians, all who live there. But a Zionist also understands that Israel also belongs to the Jewish people. And it's confusing and it's anomalous, but I don't want to live in a world where American Jews feel cut off from Israel. And I don't want to live in a world where Israelis feel cut off from American Jews. And it's not just because Israelis need the donations. I argued that yesterday, that we're way beyond that. It's we need that sense of mission, we need that sense of peoplehood. We need that sense of responsibility, we need that sense of mutuality. And again, we see that Israelis, 2/3 of American Israelis even use a family notion. So, but here's the thing, and here's the mistake we always make. We get annoyed because we're not twins. We're annoyed because when we look at Israel, we don't see a mirror image. But I want to suggest that maybe by looking at Israel and not seeing a mirror image, we can sometimes learn from Israel, not just criticize Israel. And I say the same thing when I speak to Israelis. Look at American Jewry. Look at the creativity. Look at the revolution in the role of women that is now happening in many parts in Israel. It doesn't make the headlines, but it's certainly happening in my neighborhood that came from here. Anybody ever sing Birkat Hamazon? That tune came from here, and you hear it all over Israel. Just two little examples of the kind of mutual exchange. And I specifically picked a religious issue because American Jews often feel that they're being demonized, they're being disrespected, and they're being put aside on religious issues. And it's not untrue that there are certain Israeli voices that keep on doing it. So my image is, I don't know if you've ever been to Israel and had kuba soup. Kuba soup is kind of reverse chicken soup. And because you have these canedels, you have these matzo balls, but they're filled with meat. But when you go and order kuba soup, you have to order two different kinds. There's either lemon-based or the beet-based. So you take the same ingredients, right, of the ball, and you plop it into lemon, and you plop it into beets, and all of a sudden, they have a different color. When I travel around the Jewish world, and I'm so lucky to be hosted by wonderful people like you, it's really a privilege. We all look alike in many ways. When I was in Russia in 1985, and I'm wandering around Russia, the heart of the awfulness of the vast prison camp, it looked like my boobies and zanies. And you see in Israel too, we all look alike. And I'm always fascinated, especially because we as a family chose at a certain point when our kids between the age of 5 and 12 to go to Israel. I'm always fascinated by what does genetics do? What does the family do? And what does the culture do? And so, and we see that, it's also you can just take out the meat and just have an all-American hamburger. And by understanding the similarity at the difference, we get to that word which is so hard for Jews to pronounce. Humility. A little humility, a little understanding that, we're different, but. And now I want to go deeper, and then I'm going to stop for questions before I continue. I want to give one more frame, then we'll have a little bit of conversation, and we'll see where we want to go. Let's think about what diaspora Jewry has to do every single day. And what does Israeli Jewry have to do every single day? Most important thing is to survive. You want to get to thrive, but you want to start with survival. What is the fundamental challenge for diaspora Jews as a Jewish community, surviving as a minority in an extremely welcoming society? Elie Wiesel, of blessed memory, used to tell a story from the Talmud, someone who held on to his umbrella, and he loved his umbrella, and he loved his umbrella, and he loved his umbrella. And he also loved his umbrella because it was raining and raining and raining. And what happened? One day, the sun starts shining, and what does he do? He gives up the umbrella. What's that a metaphor for? Do we only hold on to our Judaism when we feel attacked by anti-Semites? Is Judaism only anti-Semitism? Is Zionism only anti-Zionism? Or does it give us conversation about who we want to be, who we've been, and who we are today? Does it give us tools to have a conversation with our children and our grandchildren about meaning, about our souls? Does it push us not only to defending the Jewish body, but also to thinking about the Jewish soul and thinking about the soul of humanity? But the fundamental challenge in a world where even with today's surge in anti-Semitism, on the whole, the story of American Jewry has been a story of a people being blessed and welcomed and able to prosper and able to thrive in ways they were never able to thrive in Poland, in Russia, in Bukhara, because now in Queens there's a strong Bukharian community. In Morocco, and you have to remember that we're not just Ashkenazi Jews, we're not just what I call the Jewish folk people, but we're now an increasingly broader community and diverse community. What's the fundamental challenge of Israel? Surviving as a sovereign majority state in a hostile Middle East. So whereas sometimes the joke is that American Jews might be loved to death, it's not a joke that Israelis have to worry about at this point. I hope speedily in our day that may happen. And the more peace more we have, as I argued yesterday, the more opportunities we have to build. By the way, when I was in Jerusalem during the height of the COVID lockdown, and delegation came to the old city from Bahrain, they were mobbed with love. People came out of their houses even during the time that people were nervous to just say, welcome, thank you, it was so exciting. Now we know that it may not be the most democratic country in the world, but there was at least a breakthrough. It was an excitement. And it gets even more complicated. American Jews in many ways see themselves as descendants of Isaiah. Lo yisagor el charev, right? Don't raise sword against one another. The lion shall live with the lamb. The mission that's emphasized again and again, an essential mission in Reform Jewry, has been the mission of liberal ideals, of pluralism, of universalism, of peace. Now, if you read all of Isaiah, I know the two rabbis will help me out, there are more violent parts, there are more particularist parts, but the parts that have been conveyed the most popular parts are the ones about this Isaiah image. And it fits because in a society where we're a minority, we want to call out those who break down the universal approach, the liberal approach, the welcoming approach. And we want to build up those who are going to lead to a more liberal, welcoming society. It works for us. It makes perfect sense. Israelis are cousins. They're living in a promised land. They need to create a secure land. They're dealing with a different kind of reality of the state. And so I call them Davidians. Because David, at the end of the day, had to defeat Goliath. David, at the end of the day, had to defend his lambs against wolves. David, at the end of the day, had to ensure Jewish sovereignty. Now, again, our rabbis will point out that David also had the harp and wrote the Psalms and had the dreams. But when we clash, it's like when that particular group of American Jews clashed at Auschwitz, when we emphasize our differences, not our commonalities, when we emphasize where we disagree rather than where we agree, we often see this Davidian Isaiah thing happening. We often see this emphasis, oh no, I want to be more welcoming, I want to be more tolerant, I want to be more Protestant in many ways, religiously, where we have many different denominations. And Israelis say, no, I want to be more defended, I want to be more secure, I want to be more Catholic. With one approach, David Ben-Gurion was extremely secular. When he's talking to Rabbi Shlomo Goren, who helps establish the Israeli army, they have a conversation. By the way, two very interesting parts of this conversation. One is the religious parents at the time didn't want their religious children serving in the general branches of the army. They wanted separate religious units. And Shlomo Goren and David Ben-Gurion said, no. We're one country, and we're one army. We left the ghetto, we're not going to ghettoize you. Something that are ultra-Orthodox sometimes need to remember. But they also say, as a result, because we want them to feel comfortable in every single unit, we will have one standard of kashrut, the most Orthodox. We will have one approach to Shabbat, the most Orthodox. We'll have one approach when, God forbid, a soldier dies. And that's why people say that the synagogue that Israelis don't pray in is the Orthodox one, right? That need for sovereignty led to a certain kind of all or nothingness. Now, I'm not here to justify the disgusting remarks that were even said today in one of our Torah I read about today about the Reform movement. God forbid, that's not what I'm saying. But I'm trying to explain the historical rationale behind the hyper-secularists buying into an approach to Judaism, which is problematic in America, which is more denominational. And I'm trying to get us to understand some of the things that are going on behind the scenes or historically, so that we can have that humility and we can have that conversation. And for me, the most important thing, is that I want Israelis to learn about Isaianism from you, and I want you to learn about Davidianism from Israelis. Because I think one of the fears we have in the American Jewish community is to our kids. We always see it to our kids, but we don't see it in ourselves. Have enough of a sense of pride, enough of a sense of patriotism, enough of a sense of ability to defend themselves and willingness to defend themselves. That's the Davidian streak. And when we look at some of the figures coming up in the Israeli politics, I want them to have a little more Isaiah. I want them to have a little more humility. I want them to have a little more liberalism. So I think there's a healthy dialogue that we can have through our differences. So our differences shouldn't lead us to building up walls. Our differences should lead us to opening our arms and our hearts. I want to stop there and take a break, cleansing breath, and see if anyone has questions, comments, reactions before I continue. Do you see what I'm trying to? What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to bring us on a journey where we see the difference. I'm not denying the difference. Last night, when I was speaking to a small group of the board and past presidents, I say, I don't use complexity as an escape route. But I use complexity as a tool so we can understand and we can start seeing, where are the wires crossed? Where are things that we have in common, and where we have things we can work together? So, okay, I will continue.
Sorry, one.
Yes, please.
And I know you talked about this, I wasn't here unfortunately, but like in with Axel, you mentioned that Israel needs American Jewry, that there's still, and we heard another speaker who referenced an idea that Israel doesn't so much care about, the American point of view. They have their own thing going on. So very quickly, what are the elements that you think tie Israel to American Jewry?
It's a great question. Thank you. First of all, I'll just talk in polls. I think it was 3 elections ago, in this wonderful spate of 5 elections we had. They did a poll where they asked Israelis, they said, is it important for you that the incoming prime minister be seen as the leader of the Jewish people and reach out to world Jewry? And over 70% said yes. Now, when it comes to voting on the actual day when you go into the voting polls, is that number 1 on your list? No. Is it number 2? Is it number 3? Is it number 4? Is it number 5? No, it's way far down the list. Why? Because you have security, you have economy, you have all kinds of other, you have personality, you have party loyalty. Similar thing happens with American Jews. You ask American Jews, do you care about Israel? 82% said yes. Even in the Orthodox world, let alone in the mainstream liberal American Jewish world, when they go into the voting booth, most Americans vote on domestic issues. Why? Because most elections are fought over domestic. So it doesn't mean that, and in fact, you see that certainly when it comes to issues like, especially today, but this polling goes back 5 and 10 years ago, American Jews in the voting booth are more pro-choice than they are pro-Israel. Does that mean that they're anti-Israel? No, it just means that choice has been a much more active issue in American politics. By the way, I love to say God bless America. Look at the arguments over Israel in the 2020, 2016, 2012, 2008, 24, 2000 election between the 2 major presidential nominees. I'm more pro-Israel. No, I'm more pro-Israel. No, I'm more pro-Israel. No, I'm not like Europe. But to get to your question, no, the reason why I sleep well at night is because I'm a historian. Because I see all the problems, but I also see how far we've come, and I go, my goodness, we're so lucky to be living in this world. So why? So and you're right. There is this new ugly streak that we're hearing in, unfortunately, too many of the members of the incoming government say, "Oh, we don't need that." Right? There was this quotation claiming, and Ambassador Dermer has distanced himself from it. So I don't want to get into whether it's true or not. But he's saying, "Oh, we don't need those liberal Jews. They're betraying us. We just need the evangelicals. They're the ones who are supporters." So first of all, that's just not true, because we know how effective American Jewish support is in terms of maintaining that healthy relationship between America and Israel. We know that without American Jewry, even with the evangelicals, it would be a different dynamic. We know how important it is to, so first, it's political. Second, it's ideological. That's why I quoted Aleph Bet Yoshua. When Israelis look at themselves, and the reason why they give that answer in the poll is because when Israelis look at themselves and look at their country, and let's be honest, you can't really, but in a world which is much more fluid, where you can, if you're in high tech, you could get jobs in 5 other countries than Israel, right? Most Israelis are much more fluid than they used to be. We see there are many Israelis who've chosen to live abroad. Why do you stay? You stay because of idealism. You stay because of community. You stay because of family. And part of the idealistic component is understanding that we are this experiment in Jewish history, and we are the center of the Jewish world, and we are the home for all the Jews. And that's why when you ask them in a poll, is it important for you that the prime minister act like the head of the Jewish people? It's of course, for 2/3, for 3/4. And that's why there are all these initiatives. I'm right now on a WhatsApp group of over 200 young Israeli leaders, and one old guy, who are talking in Hebrew, which is the first time I've ever been involved in Hebrew conversations about how we strengthen the relationship between Israel and the diaspora. And the origins of it was 5 years ago when Bibi Netanyahu blew up the Kotel compromise. And there was a sense of crisis. And many Israelis said, oh my goodness, we don't want to lose it. Now it's true that the tabloid newspaper, Yediot Ahronot, when there was this moment of crisis, right? Look how often we're predicting that there's this rupture, the divorce is always happening and it never happens. So in Yediot Ahronot, they had a 2-page spread, $1,000, $1 billion. $1 billion is the amount of money we risk losing if we burn the American Jewish tie. But I'm trying to emphasize that to me, the ties go much deeper. The wonderful, beautiful philanthropic relationship is an expression of a deeper relationship. And Israelis know that because since the 1930s, there's been a major shift in the Jewish world, right, demographically, right? Think of the map of the Jewish world in the 1900s, the 1920s, and the 1930s. It was Europe, it was Russia, it was Jews in the Arab lands. Now, the two main Jewish communities are Israel and the United States, or in Israel and the American Jewry. We have no choice. So we need one another ideologically, we need one each other in terms of family, so we're not at that point, despite some of our leaders washing their hands, of the Israeli people giving up. And by the way, as someone who I told you has the privilege of working in a volunteer capacity with Birthright for over 20 years. Birthright has this thing called the Mifgash program, where people talk about there have now been over 800,000 Birthright participants, 750,000 of them come from all over the world. 65% of them or so from the United States of America. The other 50,000 are Israelis who've been on this mifgash, who have been the Israeli soldiers on the bus. And I've seen with my own eyes, Israeli soldiers who sometimes face the worst, crazy, terrifying moments, with tears in their eyes saying, until I got on this bus, I knew I was defending my parents and my family. I knew I was defending my home. And I never realized I was also defending my people. And those 50,000 young Israelis, the tens of thousands of Israeli shlichim, of emissaries who come and work in Metro West and elsewhere, they come back understanding how powerful bond is. And I'll say one more thing, I'm going on, so I think it's a very important question. There's a cliche among Israeli academics, because Israeli academics, of course, many of them are, super sophisticated, which means super secular, and they're super scientific, that when they go on their postdocs or they go on academic exchanges, they go to America as Israelis and they come back as Jews. It's a delightful cliche which actually shows what this community, the American Jewish community, gives to Israelis. And they don't do it because that's not a response to anti-Semitism, right? Because Israelis are as good to fight anti-Semitism. They come back because you're looking for Jewish vocabulary. See, yes, now there are these different stores in different pockets of New Jersey, I know, which have all the Israeli products you could ever possibly want. But when they're looking, sometimes they come to synagogue. And when they come to synagogue, they find a range. And some of them go to Chabad, but some of them come here and to reform synagogues, and they see there's a multiplicity of views. I also have seen in birthright groups, all the camp kids start singing what they call Birkat Hamazon, right? And the Israelis are flabbergasted. And then they see how fun it is and they join in. So there is this back and forth. It often doesn't make the headlines. It's our job to both transcend the headlines, but also bring it out and emphasize it. And one of the problems we have in this world is we take so many things for granted. One of the things we as educators and as activists have to do is highlight the things we take for granted. Yes?
What do American Jews do about the 18% who don't care if Israel exists?
About the 18, well,
You said
18%, yeah. So we have a lot of work to do, right?
Wow.
Right, your metric is better than mine. The 18% of American Jews who don't care. It's funny, the ones who get the headlines are the haters. The people from Jewish Voices for Peace who've never said anything positive about Israel. I'm much more worried about what I call the chorus line Jews. You know the chorus line Jews are? Remember one of the most famous songs from a chorus line? And I felt nothing. Those who feel nothing. Those who feel something, I think we spend 80% of our energy trying to convince them they're not convincing. This is one of the things when I speak to young Jews on campus, I say, if there's some extremist, either a Jewish extremist or a non-Jewish extremist, who is convinced that Israel is this evil apartheid state, we waste way too much time trying to convince it. It's not going to happen. And in fact, we start yelling, they start yelling, and you know who we lose? Our roommates. We lose the reasonable people. So I think the American Jewish community spends way too much time worrying about the small group of people who get the op-eds in the New York Times and get all the headlines. But I think our real challenge is the next generation who just is who, by the way, have gotten so much pressure from us. The messaging we often give them is the most important thing for them to do is to get into good college, get high grades, so they can get a good job, so they can get a nice house. We have to own our own mixed messaging here. I told you I didn't come here to air kiss. Right? And we have to own that there's nothing more important than college, right? We tell them, you have to get into college, they get to college, and then they're told in college by professors and by fellow students that there's nothing more evil in the universe than Israel. So some of them buy into it, and others push back, and I know how many of your young people have been heroes in this, but too many of them just go, and I just give up. I don't want to be unpopular. God forbid. I don't want to lose followers on Instagram, God forbid. I don't want to, I literally was hosting a friend of mine, and his daughter was 16 or 17 at the time, posted pictures of our Shuklevinsky tour. Have you ever taken like one of those food tours? Really fun. And as she posted pictures, she saw she was losing likes and losing followers, and she stopped posting. And birthwriters have told me that they go for 10 days, they ghost, they just disappear for 10 days. So, because also one of the things we've told our kids is it's not only important to get in, but it's important to be popular. So I think we have a lot of work to do. Part of the reason why I spend so much time with Birthright is because I've seen no more effective intervention in the last century and a half since the Zionist movement started that lets young Jews on their own see with their own eyes, smell with their noses, hear with their ears what this place is. And that's where actually the haters help us. Because they come to Israel expecting to see chaos and army and terrorism. And they come to the country, which I mentioned yesterday is the 5th most safe country in the world for tourists. They come to a country where people are happy. And by the way, I often say, even when I travel around, if I talk about somebody being killed, I got everybody beating it out of my hand. When I talk about the Shabbat that my kids had yesterday, which happened to be a beautiful day in Jerusalem, and the birds were chirping, and the sun was shining, and they were praying, everybody goes to sleep. Because we're addicted to this, what I call this Israel indignation industry. So it starts at home. It starts with us conveying to our kids that Israel isn't this thing over there, it isn't this problem, it isn't this source of headaches, but it's in our core, it's in our hearts. Making them realize how lucky they are historically to be living in this moment where they have two huge Jewish communities, the American Jewish community and the Israeli Jewish community, who should be helping one another, who can be helping one another, who can be inspiring one another, and making sure that they go. I also have this little formula of 2 DW equals 1 IL. 2 Disney World trips equals 1 Israel trip. Thank the grandkids. Yes, I see 2. Hi.
Hi, my question is about, one of the things I focus on a lot in the American Jews versus Israeli Jews issue is that in Israel, you have a demographic issue with very ultra-Orthodox people. Like, if you do the math, in another generation, you could be looking at a majority, a close majority of the population being ultra-Orthodox. And the way they define Judaism, who is Jewish, is really not representative of what Americans define as. I mean, even in this congregation, in many congregations, many of the people that go to synagogues nowadays in America would not be considered Jewish by their, and that's, to me, like, I feel like I worry with like my children, if like by the time they're adults, if they would feel welcome in Israel anymore, given that climate, you know what I mean?
Thank you for that. First of all, you're inviting me to go back and next time we do this presentation, change that slide. Because when I talked about red and blue, I was talking about, sort of more BB and Ben Green, whatever. Yeah. I think I'd have, after that slide, a second slide saying it's not just red and blue, but it's blue and red and, super red or whatever. I can figure out some clever way of saying that there is this fear. I was also asked that question at the beginning. There is a stack of newspaper articles and analyses going back to the 1950s, talking about how the demographics of Israel are about to turn. There's an excellent book by a friend of mine named Noah Ephron, who talks about the fear of Haredism in Israel. And he's the one where I learned, and you see in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, the 80s. And here's the secret. Yes, when you draw the trend lines of how many Jews are born to Haredi families in Israel, it seems to grow exponentially. But there are 2 things that balancing out. First of all, take the Haredim out. Israelis have the highest birth rate in the Western world. Over 3.2. And that includes Israeli Arabs, but also includes Israeli, secular Jews, because there's a family feeling and there's a sense of we're not going away. The second thing is that there's a huge surge in Israeli popular culture. The ones that make it here are like shtisel, right? But there are shows in Israel, there are sitcoms, there are plays about those Haredim who run away. There's a whole phenomenon of Haredim who run away. Because what happens, when I'm born to a Haredi family, I'm now Haredi for the rest of my life demographically. When I leave, there's no checkout counter. There's no, right? And when I look at their fears and I look at my fears, and it's interesting, and let's bring in the American Jewish, I'm validating the fears, right? Because I see the headlines. I don't know many, I know, I said this last night too, that most of my friends, when they criticize the ultra-Orthodox as a potential drain on the state. They don't look at them as potentially wiping out the state. Ultra-Orthodox Jews, with their fight against smartphones, and their fight against civilization, and their fight against the reform, and their fight against me, and their fight against Facebook, what are they fighting against? They're fighting against their fear that their kids are going to be modernized. So I want us to close our eyes, those of us who have Jewish grandparents and great-grandparents and great-grandparents, and imagine what did our great-great-great-great-grandparents, they looked like them, and now we look like us, and we're a majority.
Well, no, like in
So-
America, like the number of people that leave, ultra Orthodox is very small. I mean, it's a really, the
Right.
numbers are pretty, I don't know how it is in Israel.
In Israel, the numbers are growing.
but-
And because they live cheek by jowl and they see it, there was one, it wasn't sick, it was like one of these, multi-part things about a Haredi, a halfway house for ultra-Orthodox. And all the challenges they faced as they ran away, and the challenges they've got. So you see the strain in popular culture. You also see, by the way, I have a friend who's a gynecologist. She says that when people come to visit in birthing rooms, you often see that if like a Haredi family, there are also 2 or 3 or 4 secular people coming. That you go to weddings and you see a mix in a way that you don't see here. We were talking about the big story the other day about how increasingly in America you're red, you're blue. In Israel, you go to a wedding, you see a range of possibilities in terms of how to express your Jewishness. So, am I right or are you right? Who knows, right? But my challenge to all of us is to make sure that we build up the core. And by building up the core, then whatever goes on in the extremes will be irrelevant. Yes.
I want to ask you to expand on something from the first question in this Q&A part. I don't ask this in a theological way, but a sociological or to a historian. Do American Jews think that God resides more in Israel and with Israeli Jews? And the opposite, do Israeli Jews think that God is distant in America with American Jews?
So it's an interesting question. Look, theologically, right, God is everywhere. There's definitely a sense in Israel that part of the power of the promised land and part of it is you're walking the biblical lands, right? What was very interesting was when people like David Ben-Gurion and Moshe Dayan and Golda Meir, the secular pioneers, kind of brought God down through the Bible into the land. And they don't necessarily worship God. They didn't worship God, but they worshiped the power of the land as a kind of godly place and a place where Judaism can happen better. What's really interesting is that both American Jews and Israeli Jews don't talk about God so much, right? And it's very interesting. I don't want to criticize any other denomination. I grew up in the conservative movement, and God didn't exist really. You just didn't deal with God because it was too uncomfortable. So our prayers weren't really prayers; they were happy, happy folk songs. We had to make God a part-time God because if God was a full-time God, that meant that when we did what we were supposed to do, which is go out on the street and act normal and be Gil Troy and be accepted, we were putting God aside. And the Jewish God isn't such a compartmentalized God. So the God that I grew up with, that's why I'm not going to judge anybody else's, but the God that I grew up with was a very limited God. In general, studies show that most American Jews tend not to talk about God. When they talk about what's the basis of their identity, right? The famous Pew study, sense of humor, and a certain sense of Holocaust trauma, and a sense of destiny, and then food. Where God was low on the list, right? Now, when they did it with Israel, it was very interesting. First of all, they asked similar questions to Israelis, and the Israelis didn't answer sense of humor. One of my friends said, "Oh my goodness, am I living in a country that has a sense of humor?" I said, "No, you're just living in a country which doesn't associate its Jewishness with sense of humor." Right? More Israelis, according to polls, believe in God. It's actually very interesting, and this is actually the same way that I was talking before to you about the underlying impact that American Jewry has on Israel that we don't see and don't make headlines. There's more and more of an impact of Mizrahi Jewry on Israeli culture, and Mizrahis, those from the his parents and grandparents came from the Arab world, have a much more, I'm going to use a bad word, fundamentalist connection to God. They have a very instinctive, God is in their lives. My friend who's from Tunisia who hosts Armenian, he is a super successful entrepreneur. And his partners are his family, his parents, and God. And he has an intimate relationship, a daily relationship with God that I frankly don't have. So I think in Israel, there is a sense of godliness more, and there's more of a conversation about God, but I don't think it's because of necessarily the real estate location. I think it's more sociological, that there's been this influx of people who really are on intimate terms with God. And in America, there's actually a growing secularization, right? Where God has been increasingly put aside and God has been politicized, so that people think, oh, in order to buy into God, I have to buy into a whole right-wing political bundle, which, by the way, and here I'm quoting both Bill Clinton and Barack Obama, it is a huge mistake for the left to let the right own family faith and flag. It's the best way to lose elections, but I'm not talking about elections. It's the best way to lose our souls. And both Barack Obama and Bill Clinton were very careful when they ran their campaigns to make sure to show that they weren't ceding that. But that's a whole other conversation. Yes, sir.
So I'm with you. I pick up on your identity Zionism. I guess I've been that way all my life. I've got family and friends, and I've been there a lot. But I'm scared. How am I supposed to feel when 3 or 4 or 5 of Bibi Netanyahu's selections don't recognize me? They want to wipe me out. So how am I supposed to feel? What am I supposed to do?
So I call this, I'm gonna get in trouble here. I call this the Trump opportunity. When Donald Trump was president, I checked. I literally called the Canadian embassy, the Israeli embassy. And I said, has there been a surge of visa applications because people are so upset, people are so against Trump? There weren't any. I didn't meet any person. I met one very wealthy person who moved from Trump Tower. But they can afford, and I think they did okay. Right, and what was the Trump opportunity? The Trump opportunity was what the resistance. The Trump opportunity was when I'm a patriot and I'm really committed to the country, and it's my home and it's my homeland. I'm not going to run away. I'm going to double down and I'm going to fight. And my challenge to American Jews is so I have the same problem. I'm trying not to be too partisan these days, but like I can't tell you how upset I am by someone like Ben-Gvir. I told the story yesterday about my son watching the video. My son who's in the army, seeing seeing what Ben-Gvir could possibly do to undermine discipline in the army. My other son, who's 25, I don't want to appall you, but he has a gun because he finished as an officer. And by the way, when I walk around with him, I'm never scared in Israel. I jog all over the place. I've never had any incidents of 15 years of jogging. But the fact that he has a gun, I trust him. But he's been trained. And when he saw Ben-Gvir during the campaign walk into Sheikh Jarrah and pull out a gun, because protesters were yelling at him, and there was a security guard right next to him who had a much bigger gun and was much taller, my son was really appalled. Because he said, you only pull out a gun if you're willing to shoot, and there was no reason to shoot. And he was just doing, the evil version of virtue signaling, right? He was just trying to show what a. So I'm completely appalled by the rise of Ben-Gvir and others, Avi Maoz, whatever. But I'm not giving up on Israel. I'm not giving up. I'm working harder to change it. I'm working harder to make sure that there's pressure on Bibi to change it from within. So I'm not saying I don't understand your pain, and I'm not saying I don't understand your frustration. But I want you to take that and move it into activism, into thoughtful, strategic activism, which leverages our power as a mostly non-Orthodox community. By the way, one of the things I love to do with Orthodox Jews is to say, I had a friend, I learned this from a friend of mine, used to go around to non-Jews and say, do you know how many Jews there are in the world? They were asking non-Jews how many Jews. They think there are 20 billion, 30 billion, right? Right? Like he had a list. He was one of these Olympics. He had a long list of all the mistakes they made. So I like to ask Orthodox Jews, how many Orthodox, what's the percentage of Orthodox Jews in America and Israel? 80%, 70%, 69%, because they live in this delightful Orthodox bubble where they go to the same pizzeria place, the same, you're in New Jersey, I don't have to tell you, right? Like, and so they think, but the percentages are very small. So it's really important that we have a constructive, positive, romantic, Zionist, critical voice that says you're crossing a line. And so I want us to take that pain and turn it into a game. That's my answer. I'm not gonna apologize for them. I'm not going to explain them away. You know, I could also hide behind the fact that they won by a very small percentage, but and as one of the things I am challenging American Jews is to remember that as awful as we find this government, it was a wonderful, I thought, interesting experiment for the last year and a half. And it didn't really change American Jewish-Israel relations. I didn't see a real surge of love. So we have to be careful that I understand our frustration with particular governmental policies, but one of the things I'm trying to suggest is that there are certain kind of underlying forces that are affecting the conversation regardless of who's in power. And I'm going to wait them out. I'm going to do everything I can to undermine them. I'm going to respect the democratic process, but I'm going to wait them out. That's my approach. Yes, yes, sir.
Yeah, you talk a lot about the tensions of passionate feelings of different groups and their opposition. But I see the main threat to American and perhaps maybe also Israeli Jewry as indifference. Especially from people who say, I'm not interested. They don't argue because it's not important enough to argue about. And you mentioned birthright would be well, perhaps the one best method of showing the importance of Judaism and Israel and keeping a perspective on it. But that implies a kid that is willing to go on birthright. So how do you, and it's the number or fraction of young adults who have this indifference is not a trivial fraction that you can just dismiss, you know, a few percent. It's, I don't know, 18%, 18, so a bit higher, but it depends how you define demographics. But it's a serious problem. But you're
So first of all, I hope I didn't convey any sense that I don't think it's a serious issue. I basically spent the last 20 years of my life, instead of writing about American history, writing about these issues and trying to build bridges and trying to help people find conceptions. And what I found is that when you actually talk about what I call identity design, you talk about Israel not just in the political terms, when you and not as a dodge, but as I said on Friday night, as a foundation. As you talk about the possibilities and the opportunities of having this conversation about who we are and where we've come from and where we're going. You see it in people's eyes, you see it in birthright students' eyes, you see it in students who've only heard both from the right, the Israel guilt trip, and from the left, the I hate Israel trip, right? And so there are two issues here. One is the gravitational physics of the Arab-Israeli conflict, where the Arab-Israeli conflict has been imposed on us, boom, 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 by the UN and by the media, and now unfortunately by top professors in universities and by fellow students in universities. And so it's all about that. So you have to, where do you stand on that issue? And that drowns out the song. It drowns out the dance. It drowns out the thoughtful conversation. It drowns out the spiritual conversation. It drowns out, I have to say, by the way, one of the things by living in Israel, I've actually learned more about God, and I've learned more about an intimate relationship with God just because I have more friends who are in an I thou relationship with God, not an I it relationship with God, as Martin Buber would have said. So there's the problem of the noise. But you're zeroing in on the bigger problem, which is the problem of the indifference. The I felt nothing. And there I really think a lot of it starts at home. I really think we have to look and we have to do an honest look at what is the messaging in typical American Jewish home about Judaism, about Shabbat, about Israel, about Zionism, even more than that, about the search for meaning. Anytime I sit with American Jewish kids, I ask them, I said, what do grown-ups ask you? I did this 2 weeks ago with a group of kids from Yeshiva University, so Orthodox kids, birthright kids. What do grown-ups ask you? They're, these are 18-year-olds, 20-year-olds, 22-year-olds. What's the question that grown-ups ask the most? Where are you going to college? What are you going to be when you grow up? Right? And so what's the messaging they get? The most important thing is to go to a good college so I can be something when I grow up. And when I ask them, are you Jewishly ambitious? I say, what kind of soul do you want to have when you grow up? And by the way, I do this with non-Jewish kids too, right? That's not the Jewish. They look at me like, who's this maniac? I love the fact that Jewishly ambitious is an awkward term. I don't want to find a more elegant term. I want it to sound, right? When we're preparing for Rosh Hashanah, what's the big talk? How big is the brisket and how beautiful is the hat? I'm serious, right? And so I could blame all the others. I could blame all the outside forces. But we have to own the inside forces, the internal messaging. And one of the things Natan Sharansky and I recently did is we wrote an article about the importance of gap year programs. That right now, if you look, the Orthodox world has a very rich series of alternatives for gap year. And there's kind of an assumption. I actually literally have a nephew who's in the Orthodox world who had a young woman who broke up with him because he hadn't spent the year in Israel, and so she didn't feel like he had enough of a connection and love for Israel. My wife says there are probably other issues. That's what I heard. And I don't know. I'm an uncle. I don't ask a follow-up question. Right, but it's become the baseline. Do you know how many in a given year? How many non-Orthodox American Jewish kids, or a potential population of 10 or 20,000, go on gap year programs, year in Israel program before they go to college? Between 700 and 900. Really small numbers. And we wrote an article saying, you know what? The American Jewish community needs to ramp it up. Part of it is that many of those programs are identity programs, and you know me, I love, like you've heard, that's my favorite word. But I also want like a really top-notch academic program. I want a super STEM program. I want to appeal to those kids who are so ambitious, and I want them to say, hey, wait a minute, by taking a year, I can sharpen my skills in that way. I want to appeal to the kids who are a little nervous about going into a woke university and want to learn about liberal values and critical thinking and the great books, and then they'll be able to go on to Harvard and Yale and Princeton and Rutgers or whatever they need. But part of me also said in the article, this connects. As we said, the messaging from rabbis, from parents, from grandparents has to change. The question has to be, oh, are you considering spending year in Israel? What are you doing with your time? What are you doing with your soul? So this is just one little example of how we can change the conversation. And we can actually see the messaging that we give to our own people, to our own kids. I want to summarize with 3 points and then liberate you. Okay, one more question.
I can wait till you finish.
No. I want to get the question and then I'll do my summary.
Getting back to Israel, you spoke the other night extensively about all the wonderful things Israel has done as a nation over the 75-year history. But one thing that Israel does not do a very good job in is public relations, PR. And my question is, what do you think Israel can or should be doing to improve on that, to give a better message to the world? That is there something that Israel could be doing or should be doing?
Thank you for that. In the same way that I want, and I said this yesterday, that I want Israel to be driving the peace train and to use all its startup nation creativity to think of diplomatic solutions for this Palestinian conflict, which of course we now learned is only one of the many Arab-Israeli conflicts, right? Because we had a mess yesterday, and the more conflicts we solve, the less despairing we will be. So too, I need us to use better brand power to figure out how to improve Israel's PR. Having said that, and I'll give some suggestions in a second, I think we also have to understand that a lot of the hostility against Israel is not about the facts, and it's not about this PR strategy or that PR strategy. It's about that good old-fashioned disease called anti-Semitism. And in a poison sea, there's only so many anti-pollutants that'll work. And so I start off by that, by saying that we need to improve our conversation. I'll tell you why most important in a second. But we also have to recognize that the big problem may just be bigger than us. And it depresses me to say that because I grew up in a world where I was constantly fighting with my Polish-born grandfather. He saw anti-Semites behind every tree. And I said, no, Grandpa, we're in America. We're in the post-Auschwitz covenant. It's different here. The world has changed. And you know what my moment when I realized I was wrong was? In 2002, Daniel Pearl, the Wall Street Journal reporter, was kidnapped. And he was kidnapped as an American, but he was beheaded as a Jew. And he was forced on that snuff video to say, my name is Daniel Pearl, my father is Jew, and I'm a Jew. And it sent chills up my spine. Daniel Pearl and I were both born in the 1960s. Daniel Pearl and I were both lucky enough to go to fancy colleges. I went to Harvard, he went to Stanford. Daniel Pearl and I were both lucky enough to have professions. I became a professor, he became a reporter. Daniel Pearl and I were with world-class institutions, McGill University, Wall Street Journal, and we were Americans. We felt quite quintuply protected. We were transcending history. And my student said, what kind of fool was he? It was after 9/11. He was trying to break the story about some of the hijackers of 9/11. He said, what kind of fool was he going down that alley into a madrasa in Pakistan? I said, how is that kind of fool? He said, I'm a reporter. I'm protected. And I'm trying to tell their story. And then I realized how deep Jew hatred goes. And it breaks my heart when I have to tell that to young people. It breaks my heart when I have to announce it to you. So part of it is we really are swimming in an ugly sea. We've seen the Sunnis only gotten crazier and messier. But nevertheless, we have to take up your challenge for us. Because, let us be honest, the greatest victims of the campaign against the delegitimization of Israel is not Israel. It's our kids. Israelis come and go and do their thing regardless of what's said in the UN and regardless of what's said in the New York Times. But our kids, it leads to the indifference. It leads to those who really turn on us. It leads to what I call the Peter Beinartization of the conversation, where it's all this obsession and it's all this blaming. And it leads to a loss of faith in Israel. And it leads to what I started with, which is that they're robbing the Zionist dream from us. And so, yes, I need PR strategies. Most important, as an educator, I need educational strategies. And to me, the educational strategies start at home. The educational strategy starts with wonderful people like you. The educational strategies start with Birthright and with the trips you're going to take to Israel. And most important, I quote John Dewey, the great American philosopher, who said, in democracy, it's very clear. What do we need? He said, democracy begins with conversation. And that's what we need. We need conversation. We need conversation between one another. I was in a synagogue in Florida shortly after Donald Trump won, and the rabbi said, don't talk politics. So I got up and I said, and I talked about the rain, it just happened to be about around Noah, and reading about Noah, and I talked about the rainbow, and I talked about unity. And I said, I want to give each of you a homework assignment. I want you to find somebody who voted the wrong way and talk to him or her. Because you're one community. And afterwards, I got the best correction ever. Somebody came up to me and said, I really like what you said, but I'm a psychologist. Next time you say, why don't you say, and listen to them? Wow. In Hebrew, there's a great word, katonti. I'm small. This guy was big. So I want to challenge you to listen to one another and to listen to our Israeli brothers and sisters. And listen not censoriously as we do in college campuses these days, where I wait and I listen in order to censor, in order to be. Listen generously. That's the first thing we must do. Because democracy begins in conversation. It heals communities, it can heal a nation, and it can heal this, I don't think it's rupture, I don't think it's a rift, but it can heal this let's say, contrapuntal rhythm that we sometimes find ourselves in as Americans and Israelis. That's my first challenge and invitation to you. My second challenge and invitation to you is to remember what I said with John Kennedy, which is ask not what you can do for your country, but ask what can your country do for you. Ask really how am I living in New Brunswick or Highland Park or wherever you work, so I know you're spread out. How am I benefiting? How do I gain as a parent, as a grandparent, as a person, as a searcher, as a soul, as a Jew by having that Jewish state over there? What does it do for me? How does it help me? And then how do I translate that into everything from what I call ice cream for breakfast? Because I just want our kids to have some sweet taste of Israel before they hear all the ugliness, all the bitterness. To the bigger issues. We're all searching for meaning. We're all searching for community. We're all searching for something, and Israel is an effective tool. It's worked for me. At least. It's worked for my family. I think I know how many of you for whom it's worked. So make that flip. And finally, you have to listen. You have to dream. And we have to keep hoping. That leap of hope. Because I'm the historian in the room, and I know how better off we are from 20 years ago, 40 years ago, 60 years ago, 100 years ago, 2 centuries ago, 3 centuries ago. And in that leap of hope, we acknowledge the good, we highlight that which we take for granted and no longer take for granted, and we roll up our sleeves and make tomorrow a better day. So thank you, my friends, for making tomorrow a better day.
It's not just gap year, it's televised.
Televised.
So it starts
Yes.
in
Right.
Yes. Send them in high school.
It's televised and that.
Yeah, and great, and you can't, it's just, you can't break this. And hey,
One last plug to come to Israel. We were talking about this in the car the other day. How, often we see Israel in snapshots because we only get the headlines that aren't good. And I know from my first year in Israel to my first year in rabbinical school, which was in Israel, versus when I went back for the fellowship 3 years later, there's a very different Jerusalem that I saw. And Israel, like any country, evolves, and evolves very quickly. But some of us who haven't been in 10, 15, 20 years have an image of Israel of what it was. And sometimes the only way of correcting that image is by going and seeing it for yourself and being with the people and interacting. So, for our connection to Israel, it's really important that we go, especially when we're feeling ambivalent, especially when we don't know how to react or how to think or how to connect. It's not just important to get Israelis to come here, but also important for us to go there. I'm thinking a lot about the URJ camps with sending Israelis to the camp. Every year, my wife Allison is one of the assistant directors at Crane Lake. Every year there's a slew of Israelis that all, when they go back at the end of the summer, say, I came here as Israelis, but I'm going back as Jews. And I think that's really important because that's not just important for their Judaism, it's important for our Judaism because we also need to go there and go, we went American Jews and we connected with Israelis, and now we're coming back united as one family. And I think that's how we also fight back with the 18%. 2 summers ago at Crane Lake, it's really interesting. I don't know, Rabbi Miller, if you remember the Arts shirt for the parade, I think it was 5 years ago, was "This is what a Zionist looks like." And the summer before, or right before the summer began, there was this article in Tablet magazine about how, it wasn't at one of the URJ camps, but how some of the young camp staff were pushing back against Israel. We don't want to have an Israel Day and whatever. And the camp was very nervous about what's going to happen with Israel in camp. And, some of the camp staff at Crane Lake were like walking on eggshells a little bit. And what shirt does my son Gavin choose to wear first day in the bunk? This is what a Zionist looks like. And we're all looking at him like, okay, let's see where this goes. And no one said anything. And we were getting ready to have some of the faculty and I got together. And we programmed this evening where staff could come to us and talk about Israel and have a forum, because the Tablet article said, we don't have a forum. So we're like, okay, we'll create a forum to talk about Israel. And all the Israelis came because they wanted to share that Israel wasn't just the military state, but all this beauty. And not one American staff showed up for it. And to me, that was actually a bigger problem than if people came to push against Israel. And I think that's the 18% right there, is that, who cares? And I think that then spurred this conversation of how do we inject the Israelis in with the other staff and take away the silos that were kind of separating them out. So the camp's going on, many of the camps have gone on this very interesting journey of how do we use the shluchim, these Israeli staff, not just to teach Israel to the campers, but to teach a love of Israel to the camp staff as well. And that's been a very powerful thing to watch. So all of this interacting and this gauging is incredibly important. So essentially, to summarize what I just said in about 5 seconds is come to Israel with us, because it's really important. So thank you so much, Professor Troy. This has been a phenomenal meeting. We'll see you there. Thank you, everybody.